It was November 20th, 1943, 5:31 a.m., Tarawa Atoll, Gilbert Islands. The first faint streaks of dawn broke over a pale horizon. The sea was calm but deceptive, its turquoise surface masking a battlefield waiting beneath. The tide was lower than expected. The coral reef that fringed Battle Island glistened in the morning light, jagged and unyielding. Beyond it, 1,000 yards away, Japanese bunkers and pillboxes waited. Concrete, coral, and steel fused into a single murderous fortress. And into that wall of fire, the U.S. Marines of the 2nd Division were heading straight in. U.S. Marine Corps Combat Report, November 1943. Engines growled. Higgins boats and amphibious tractors churned toward shore. But then came the realization. The boats were stopping, stranded on the reef. A silent panic rippled through the assault waves. The tide had betrayed them. Instead of gliding over, the landing craft's flat bottoms slammed onto the coral shelf and stuck fast. Ahead, the Marines could see BDO's seawall, lined with machine guns, its defenders invisible but merciless. The air split open as the first bursts of fire erupted. The lagoon turned white with geysers of water and smoke. After action log, 2nd Marines, November 1943. Men leapt overboard, weighed down with 70 pounds of gear, rifles held high, trudging through waist-deep water. Some sank, slipping into unseen craters. Others were cut down before their boots touched coral. The Japanese had been waiting for this. They had spent nearly a year transforming the small island into a fortress. With 4,500 defenders under Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki dug into bunkers connected by tunnels, each with overlapping arcs of fire. He had boasted that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. Japanese Naval Diary, October 1943. But the Marines weren't just fighting the enemy ahead. They were fighting the ocean beneath them. The reef had turned into a graveyard of steel and bodies. Smoke drifted low. Radios crackled with confusion, orders, static, and silence. The perfect, amphibious landing plan had collapsed in minutes. And yet, amid the chaos, some Marines kept moving, crawling over the reef under fire, dragging machine guns, packs, and wounded comrades through the rising tide. U.S. Navy Log, Task Force 53, 1943. What no one knew that morning was that this disaster, men stranded on reefs, under open fire, would lead to one of the most pivotal tactical evolutions in the entire Pacific War. It was here, in the coral lagoons of the Gilberts, that the Marines would learn a brutal lesson. The Pacific wasn't Europe. Its beaches were traps. Its tides are deceptive. And from this crucible would rise a new kind of amphibious warfare, one that would eventually carry them across the Central Pacific, from Tarawa to Saipan, from Peleliu to Okinawa. But in November 1943, all they knew was terror. U.S. Marine Corps Field Journal, 1943. Only hours before, the island had been pulverized by one of the most intense naval bombardments of the war. 16-inch shells from battleships like USS Maryland and USS Colorado tore through palm groves and concrete bunkers alike. Planes from the carrier USS Essex strafed trenches and gun positions. The bombardment lasted more than 3 hours, and when it ended, officers aboard the transports believed nothing could have survived. Marines cheered. The beach looked flattened from a distance. But deep underground, the Japanese garrison was waiting, alive, unbroken, and ready to kill. Pacific Fleet Bombardment Report, 1943. As the first assault waves neared the reef, it became clear that the intelligence on tides had been disastrously wrong. The invasion planners had relied on outdated British naval charts. They expected a high tide sufficient for landing craft to pass, but the moon and the shallow lagoon conspired against them. The reef was exposed by less than 3 feet of water, a natural barricade. "We're grounded on the reef. Can't move," came the reports. Officers shouted into radios for tractors, for help, for miracles. None came. U.S. Navy Hydrographic Report, 1943. The few LVT, 1-inch Alligators, amphibious tractors developed in Florida by engineer Donald Roebling, became lifelines. Originally designed for civilian rescue work in swamps, they were rushed into combat production and modified for war. With their wide tracks and low draft, they could crawl over reefs where boats could not. Now, amid chaos, They clawed forward, hauling Marines across the coral shelf under relentless machine gun fire. But there were too few. Fewer than 100 were available. Most burned out or were hit before reaching the beach. U.S. Navy Bureau of Ordnance Report, 1943. The reef became the crucible of Tarawa and the birthplace of a new amphibious doctrine. The Marines would never again take tides for granted. They would learn that reefs, once seen as obstacles, could be used as staging points. But that understanding was paid for in blood. Men lay scattered across the coral, each one caught between two elements, the sea that stranded them and the guns that tore them apart. 2nd Marine Division Report, 1943. Overhead, smoke hung heavy as destroyers moved dangerously close to shore, their guns firing point-blank at pillboxes. Pilots flying dauntless dive bombers from the carriers saw the reef littered with stalled craft, bodies, and wreckage. Some tried to mark enemy positions with smoke bombs. Others strafed anything that fired back. The Japanese were invisible until their guns spoke. It was a battle of ghosts. U.S. Navy Carrier Air Group 5 log, November 1943, by noon. The Marines had established only the smallest footholds, 100 yards of sand soaked in blood. Communications were breaking down. Artillery support was almost blind. Commanders aboard ships could barely understand what was happening ashore. Through binoculars, they saw fire, smoke, and flashes, but no movement, no progress. The fear grew that the assault had failed entirely. Fleet Intelligence Summary, November 20th, 1943. And yet, amid this storm, acts of impossible courage unfolded. Sergeant William Bordelon of the Engineers ran into open fire to destroy a machine gun nest blocking the beachhead. He was hit, rose again, and kept fighting until he fell for the last time. Corporal John Spillane dove into the lagoon to rescue wounded Marines from drowning. Each act, each life, pushed the line forward by inches. U.S. Marine Corps Medal of Honor citations, 1943. By nightfall, BDO still burned. The reef was littered with hundreds of men who had never reached the shore. And yet, the survivors who did would hold their small foothold through the night. They knew reinforcements would come at dawn. They didn't yet know that their suffering would change everything. How Marines would land, how they would fight, and even how ships would be built. Tarawa had exposed every weakness in the amphibious playbook and forced a brutal innovation. Marine Corps Historical Division, 1947. As darkness fell over the lagoon, the tide finally began to rise. The reef vanished beneath the waves once more, as if hiding the evidence of what had happened there. Radios whispered across the darkness, voices low and exhausted. The Japanese were regrouping. The next assault would begin at first light. And from the coral reef, the Marines who survived looked back toward the sea, toward the horizon from where their brothers would come again. Because what began as a disaster on the reef was about to become the blueprint for victory in the Pacific. Dawn, November 21st, 1943. The lagoon at Tarawa shimmered in the rising sun, streaked red by what had happened the day before. The surviving Marines clung to a shallow perimeter along the beach, an area barely the size of a football field. Behind them, the tide whispered over the coral reef where so many had fallen. Ahead, BDO's defenses still spat fire. But now, as reinforcements gathered offshore, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps were about to unleash something new, a tactical and technological evolution born of necessity, not theory. U.S. Marine Corps Field Log, November 1943. The disaster of the reef had revealed a brutal truth. The Pacific's geography would not yield to plans drawn on paper. The tides, reefs, and atolls of the Central Pacific were an entirely different kind of battlefield. The lesson struck hard at Tarawa, but it would change every amphibious operation that followed. What the Marines and engineers began improvising in these waters would echo across the Pacific for 2 years, an unbroken chain of adaptation under fire. Pacific Fleet Engineering Report, 1943. The LVD Alligator, once dismissed as a civilian oddity, became the symbol of that transformation. Its designer, Donald Roebling, had never imagined his invention crawling toward enemy beaches. Originally designed in 1937 to rescue hurricane victims in Florida swamps, it was now one of the most vital tools of amphibious war. The LVT-1 carried a crew of 2 and 20 troops, was powered by a 146 horsepower engine and could climb reefs up to 5 feet high at a speed of 6 knots. Its aluminum hull could shrug off small arms fire, but not heavy machine guns. Still, its unique track design, a flexible suspension with grousers, allowed it to crawl where no boat could go. Technical Manual TM 9 to 295, 1943, but the Marines needed more. Tarawa showed that the Alligator, unarmored and open-topped, was too vulnerable. Within months, the LVT-A-1 emerged, the armored amphibian. Built by the Food Machinery Corporation in California, its design replaced aluminum with a 1-inch steel plate and mounted a 37 mm M6-gun turret from the Stuart Light tank. Engineers welded extra brackets, sealed hatches against spray, and improved fuel systems to resist salt corrosion. It wasn't just an upgrade. It was evolution at industrial speed. Bureau of Ships Engineering Memo, December 1943. Inside the factories of Detroit, engineers and foremen worked around the clock. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, originally managed by Chrysler, began producing components for amphibious operations alongside Sherman tanks. The challenge wasn't just manufacturing, it was coordination. Every landing required a symphony of timing, tides, bombardment schedules, air support, and the flow of vehicles from ship to shore. That synchronization became the backbone of the Pacific Landings Doctrine. War Production Board Report, 1944, back at Tarawa, as the second day began. The new amphibious tractors, those that survived, began to ferry reinforcements and supplies directly across the reef. The first wave had been shredded, but their sacrifice had revealed the invisible map of the battlefield, the depth of the lagoon, the hidden coral heads, and the arcs of fire. Armed with that knowledge, the Marines used the reef as a platform, moving from wrecked landing craft to cover, using debris as stepping stones. It was the birth of what historians later called reef-to-reef tactics. U.S. Navy Hydrographic Division Study, 1944, and while the Marines adapted, the Japanese were stunned. Their doctrine assumed that reefs and tides would trap attackers, that American technology would fail against nature. But as the second day unfolded, they watched with disbelief as vehicles crawled over the coral like mechanical beasts, climbing through surf and smoke. One captured Japanese diary, later translated, recorded, "They come from the sea like monsters that walk on water." Intelligence translation. BDO Garrison, 1944. The battle for Tarawa turned into a brutal laboratory. Marine engineers, men of the 18th and 121st Naval Construction Battalions, risked their lives building makeshift piers out of debris and coconut logs. Using bulldozers, landing under fire, they created ramps over the reef to bring supplies in. Navy divers, part of the precursor to the Underwater Demolition Teams, UDTs, began measuring water depths by hand under sniper fire. Their sketches and tide readings, sent back to fleet headquarters, formed the first systematic mapping of Pacific reefs for amphibious landings. Navy Seabees Combat Report, 1943. For the Marines on BDO, progress came at a horrifying cost. Every yard was taken in blood. By the afternoon of the second day, Colonel David Shoup, the division operations officer, had established a thin defensive line near the pier. He famously transmitted, "Casualties, many. Percentage dead, unknown. Combat efficiency, we are winning." His message, defiant and raw, captured the spirit of the adaptation. The Marines refused to yield, even as the ocean itself conspired against them. Radio log, Tarawa, November 21, 1943. By evening, the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, managed to land fresh forces directly over the reef using surviving LVTs and makeshift causeways. Tanks, including the M4A2 Sherman Cecilia and Chicago, rolled ashore under covering fire from destroyers. Their treads clattered on coral and sand as they advanced inland, smashing through concrete bunkers. The Japanese fired point-blank with anti-tank guns, their shells ricocheting off armored hulls or detonating harmlessly in sand. The tanks became mobile fortresses in a place where cover barely existed. 2nd Marine Division Action Report, 1943. The Marines had turned a failure into innovation. Each reef landing forced a new adjustment. Engineers testing different propeller pitches, naval officers recalculating tide tables, and logisticians inventing new offload sequences to prevent congestion. The Hydrographic Office began producing custom tide and reef charts for every planned invasion, something no navy had ever done on such a scale. The U.S. military even began to experiment with reef reconnaissance submarines, tiny submersibles meant to study lagoon floors ahead of assaults. Bureau of Ships Experimental Data File, 1944. The psychological shift was just as profound. Before Tarawa, amphibious warfare was viewed as an extension of naval operations, ships delivering troops to land. After Tarawa, it became its own science. Every new invasion, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, would begin with an analysis of reefs, tides, and the possibility of using them, not avoiding them. The reef was no longer just an obstacle. It was terrain, a tool. Pacific Fleet Tactical Bulletin, 1944. For the Japanese defenders, this evolution was terrifying. Their fortifications were built to face frontal beach assaults, not a combined arms approach that crawled over reefs and hit from multiple directions. As LVTs and tanks began bypassing minefields and seawalls by crawling over coral shelves, defenders lost the geometry of their own defense. Point 1 report from a Japanese sergeant treat. The enemy comes not in lines but in waves, from the reef, from the air, from everywhere. Captured report translation. 1944. By the third day of the battle, the Marines had taken most of BDO. Shibasaki was dead, killed by naval shellfire. His boast of 100 years had lasted 76 hours. The price was staggering. Over 1,000 Marines dead, 2,000 wounded, and nearly every Japanese defender killed. But the lessons learned about tides, vehicles, logistics, and timing became sacred doctrine. U.S. Marine Corps Operational Summary, 1943. From the smoke of Tarawa rose a new mindset. Every landing from then on would be preceded by meticulous hydrographic reconnaissance. LVTs would be armored, armed, and multiplied tenfold. New craft, like the LVT for Buffalo, capable of carrying 30 men and mounting a .50 caliber gun, rolled out by the thousands. Each design improvement carried the signature of anonymous welders, engineers, and machinists who had never seen the Pacific but were shaping its battles. War Department Production Memo, 1944. Tarawa's reef had been a nightmare, but it became the beginning of mastery. The ocean could no longer surprise the Marines. They had learned to fight it as they fought the enemy, but the consequences of that mastery would ripple far beyond the lagoon. For the Japanese Empire, the psychological shock of Tarawa was devastating. Their fortresses had been breached not by brute force alone, but by adaptation, by machines crawling over reefs they had thought impassable. And for the Americans, Tarawa's reef was only the first of many. The next landings would come faster, deadlier, and more precise. What began as survival at Tarawa was about to evolve into domination across the Pacific. When the guns finally fell silent on November 23, 1943, BDO Island was a ruin. 300 acres of shattered coral, scorched palm trunks, and wrecked fortifications. The smell of salt and cordite mixed with the heavy sweetness of decay. Over 4,600 Japanese soldiers and laborers lay dead. The surviving Marines, bloodied, exhausted, stunned, moved among the wreckage in disbelief at what they had endured. Tarawa had lasted only 76 hours, but its consequences would last a generation. U.S. Marine Corps Final Action Report, 1943. The battle became the first major amphibious assault in the Central Pacific, and the first to be filmed and photographed in such raw detail. When the footage reached American theaters months later, audiences were shaken. The images of Marines struggling through waist-deep surf and of bodies tangled on the reef stripped the romance from war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt insisted the public see the truth. Tarawa's horror would become the teacher that no manual could match. U.S. Office of War Information Release, 1944. In the aftermath, analysts and engineers gathered every surviving map, photo, and report. They studied the reef's slope, the tides, the coral texture, and even the effects of underwater shell bursts. What emerged was the Joint Amphibious Doctrine of 1944, a direct descendant of Tarawa. Every future landing would begin with hydrographic reconnaissance. Every LVT would be armored and armed. Every tide prediction would be verified by divers, not theorists. The lagoon at BDO became, in essence, the classroom of the U.S. Pacific Command. Joint Chiefs of Staff Amphibious Operations Report, 1944, technological revolutions followed. The LVT-4 Buffalo replaced the earlier models with a rear loading ramp for faster offload under fire. The LVT-A-4, fitted with a 75 mm howitzer in a Sherman turret, provided mobile artillery directly from sea to shore, a leap that erased the vulnerable pause between landing and support. Factories in Dover, Buffalo, and San Jose worked in shifts around the clock. Welders who had never seen an ocean became the unseen soldiers of the Reef War. War Production Board, Industrial Output File No. 204, 1944. Meanwhile, naval architects at the Bureau of Ships redesigned landing craft altogether. They lengthened the ramps, widened the hulls, and strengthened the keels to absorb the impact of coral. Amphibious support ships, LSTs, landing ship, tank, were modified to offload directly onto reefs, using pontoon causeways built by Seabees and ours. The ocean itself was being engineered to serve the fleet. Bureau of Ships Technical Summary, 1945. But Tarawa's legacy wasn't just mechanical. It was psychological. The Marine Corps, battered yet victorious, carried from that coral graveyard a new faith in adaptation. That courage meant nothing without understanding the environment. Commanders who survived the lagoon made it doctrine. The sea is the first enemy. From Admiral Chester Nimitz down to platoon leaders, a mantra spread: recon first, strike second. It would define every assault from Kwajalein to Iwo Jima. Pacific Fleet Command Orders, 1944. For the Japanese Empire, the shock ran deeper. Post-war interrogations revealed disbelief that Americans would continue attacking fortified atolls after Tarawa. Many officers expected a pause, our evaluation. Instead, by early 1944, the U.S. was back, landing on Kwajalein Atoll using new tactics perfected on Tarawa's reefs. The Japanese defenders, still relying on static beach defenses, were overwhelmed in days. They learned too fast, one captured naval engineer later admitted. We could not fortify faster than they could adapt. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. Japanese Military Interrogations, 1946. What had begun as a bloody mistake had become a science. In Hawaii, teams of engineers, hydrologists, and divers formed the first underwater demolition teams, precursors to the Navy SEALs. These men, armed with little more than depth gauges and waterproof pencils, would swim miles ahead of fleets to measure reefs and destroy underwater obstacles. Their notes, smuggled back on film canisters, guided entire invasions. U.S. Navy UDT Manual, 1944. By the time the Marines stormed Saipan in June 1944, the reef that once trapped them had become their ally. LVTs rolled forward in hundreds, landing in perfect sequence. The tides were predicted to the inch. Seabees followed with portable piers and causeways. Offshore, floating docks unloaded tanks directly into the surf. The enemy's bunkers were flanked not from the beach, but from beyond the reef. A complete reversal of doctrine born from the lagoon at BDO. Central Pacific Force Operations Summary. 1944. The impact was not just tactical, it was industrial and cultural. The American war machine had proven that failure could be weaponized. Every shortcoming at Tarawa spawned a solution. Better radios to coordinate ship-to-shore fire, new fuel systems for LVTs, and redesigned helmets for surf combat. Even the Marine Corps training films shifted, teaching recruits to read waves, recognize coral formations, and move underwater with their gear. Marine Corps Training Division Bulletin, 1944. Back home, Roebling's Alligator, once ridiculed as the swamp buggy, became a symbol of ingenuity. Newspapers called it the machine that walked on water. Roebling himself received the Navy's highest civilian commendation. His creation had bridged two worlds, land and sea, and turned disaster into dominance. War Department Press Office, 1945. For those who fought there, Tarawa was both triumph and trauma. Veterans recalled the sound of bullets snapping over water, the weight of sodden packs dragging them down, and the impossible clarity of the reef underfoot, beautiful and deadly. Many called it the smallest, bloodiest battlefield. Its lessons were bought with too many lives to ever forget. Marine Corps Oral History Project, 1946. In strategic terms, Tarawa shattered the myth of the impassable island. It opened the Central Pacific to the island-hopping campaign that would bring American forces within bomber range of Japan. Each reef conquered became a stepping stone for B-29s, carriers, and logistics hubs. From Tarawa's narrow strip of coral, the path to Tokyo began to take shape. Pacific Strategy Review, 1945, but the psychological scar remained. Even years after the war, Marine officers would refer to any miscalculated operation as another Tarawa. It became a warning that underestimating terrain was as deadly as underestimating the enemy. The reef, silent and ancient, had forced modern armies to remember humility. U.S. Naval War College Lecture Notes, 1948. In the Cold War years, Tarawa's influence reached even further. Amphibious doctrine evolved into assault from the sea, blending air mobility with sea power. Helicopters replaced LVTs, but the principle remained the same: to adapt to whatever terrain nature offered. Modern amphibious task forces, from Vietnam to the Persian Gulf, still trace their lineage to those lessons carved into coral in 1943. Marine Corps Amphibious Operations Handbook, 1950. Standing today on BDO's beaches, time has softened the scars. Palm trees sway where bunkers once burned. The lagoon is calm again, hiding its secrets beneath a mirror of blue. Yet beneath that water lie the remnants of the battle: twisted steel, helmets, and tracks of the first alligators. Diverse, sometimes fine shell casings stamped 43, a silent reminder of the men who tried to cross the reef before the tide rose. Tarawa War Graves Commission, 1952. Their story endures not only in history books but also in the doctrine of every Marine who learns to land on a hostile shore. It is taught as both a warning and a vow that no obstacle, natural or man-made, will ever again catch them unprepared. In the words of Admiral Nimitz, spoken months after Tarawa, among the lessons the sea teaches is respect. But respect is not fear. It is knowledge. From the reefs of Tarawa to the beaches of Okinawa, that knowledge became victory, because in the Pacific War, the Marines learned a truth as enduring as the tides themselves: that mastery of the ocean begins with surviving it.